ACT, English sentence structure. Adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. So the comparative form of a word is used to compare two actions, and the superlative form of a word is used to refer to one in a group of three or more that is the outstanding example of the action. So when we're dealing with one-syllable adverbs, we use the suffix er or est, or we use the words less or least. So say we have the word late. To get to the comparative form of the word late, we just add the suffix er to make it later. So if we have two people and one person is late by an hour and the other person is late by 2 hours, we would refer to the person late by 2 hours as being the later one. And then if we have three or more people and one person is late by 3 hours, we would refer to them as being the latest person. So that's the superlative form, latest. So we're just adding these suffixes, and really in later we're just adding r, and in latest we're just adding st because we already had e from late. Now to look at this in a more negative sense, you could use the words less or least. So you could refer to one person as being less late and another person as being the least late. Now, when you have an adverb with two or more syllables, you don't use a suffix anymore. You just use the words more or most or less or least. So we have the word carefully, and if two people both do something carefully, you would say that one person did it more carefully. And you could also say that one person did it less carefully, depending on how you want to look at it. And then also with the superlative form, if you have three or more, you would refer to one person as doing it the most carefully. And then you could refer to the person who wasn't very careful as being doing something the least carefully. Now we do have something called irregular adverbs, and what I mean by irregular is that they're irregular in the way you form the comparative and superlative forms of the adverb. So for example, we have the word well. Now the comparative form of the word well is better, and the superlative form is the best. So as you can see, better and best aren't in any way close to the word well. And so you just have to be familiar with these irregular adverbs and be familiar with how to form the comparative and superlative forms of those words. So again, adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. And we use the comparative form when we're comparing two actions, and we use the superlative form when we're comparing three or more actions.
Today we want to go over just a few of the rules related to apostrophes and their use for showing possession of something. So you've got a noun that possesses something else and you want to show possession. Sometimes it can be confusing to know where exactly to put that apostrophe. Before the S, after the S, to add an extra S. And so we just want to go over not all the rules related to the use of apostrophes, but just a few of the select ones. And I've got them on the board here behind me, so we're going to go over those briefly. Once again, apostrophes related to possession, not apostrophes in contractions or things like this, but to show possession. If there is a plural noun that ends in S, the apostrophe comes at the end, and there's no need to add an extra S. So when we think of the plural noun students, meaning more than one, and we want to talk about something that belongs collectively to the students, like their hats, the way you would write it is the students, apostrophe, hats. You would not include an extra S. It wouldn't be the students, apostrophe S, students' hats. It would just be the students' hats. Next, then, you have a plural noun that does not end in S. In this case, the apostrophe comes after the word, and then you do add an S. So in this case, the plural for man is men, and you want to talk about the men's meeting. So you put the word men, apostrophe, S, and meeting. So in the first one, it's a plural noun that ends in S, you just put the apostrophe and you're done. And the second one, the plural does not end in S, so you add the apostrophe, then the S, and what's possessed. And then finally, if you've got a singular noun that ends you've got a singular noun, it ends with the apostrophe S basically. So a singular noun, like our first one up here, we had a plural noun. The singular of students is student, and we want to talk about one student's hat. then we put the word student apostrophe s hat. So it mimics this rule here, number 2. So a singular noun, you end with apostrophe s, the student's hat. For names that end in s, proper names, things like that, you don't have to add another s at the end, but it is customary to do so. So when you talk about the Joneses' house or Texas's weather, the way you do it is the word Texas apostrophe s weather. Now it would be fine, it would be acceptable if you just put Texas apostrophe weather and people would know it means Texas's weather. And the same with Jones. The Joneses' house, you would put Jones apostrophe s, or you could put Jones and then apostrophe. Either would be acceptable, so it's not required to put the extra s, but it is customary. Now you never use an apostrophe when you're just talking about like the Joneses themselves in the plural. The Joneses went to Africa. In that case, you put Jones and then es. You don't put an apostrophe there at all. But anyway, in terms of apostrophes and possession, just to review and hopefully make it clear, if it's a plural noun that ends in s, all you do is put the apostrophe on the end. Students, hats. If it's a plural noun that does not end in s, then you put an apostrophe s. Men's meeting, mice's feet. If it's a singular noun, then you just put the noun apostrophe s to show possession. With formal things like Jones and Texas, just an apostrophe at the end is fine, but if you put an apostrophe s, that would actually be more customary. I hope this has been clear. If not, or you'd like to learn more about this, then underneath this video, if you look right beneath the video, there's a link there. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has related information to this, more information about things related to this. And also on that website, you'll find a link there to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
ACT, English, sentence structure. An independent clause contains a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. So an independent clause can stand by itself, so it can be a sentence. Like the sentence, I am running. See here we have a subject, I, and then we have this verb phrase, am, and running. And so it's a complete thought. It can stand alone and be a sentence. Now sometimes independent clauses have other clauses grouped with them, but they can also stand alone. Now a dependent clause also contains a subject and verb. However, it is an incomplete thought. And so we can take this independent clause up here and just add the word because to it, and it becomes a dependent clause. Because I am running still has a subject and a verb, but now we have the word because, and so it's a dependent clause. It's not a complete thought. You can't just say because I am running. You need something to go with it, like because I am running, I can't come to the meeting. And so that would be a complete sentence. So that's what a dependent clause is. Now, a noun clause can be a subject, a direct object, which I will abbreviate DO, an indirect object, abbreviated IO, or an object of a preposition. So, a noun clause can begin with WH question words like what, which, when, where, who, or whom, and question words like how or if. Now, an adjective clause modifies a noun or pronoun. So, an adjective clause begins with a word like who, whom, which, that, whose, when, where, why. And it's going to follow the word it modifies. Then finally, we have an adverb clause, which modifies a verb, an adjective, another adverb, or an object of a preposition. Now, an adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, because, since, unless, etc. And an adverb clause answers the question when, where, why, how, or to what degree, or under what condition. So that's a look at some different types of clauses. ACT English sentence structure. Conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, showing the relationship between them. So conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, and in addition, they show the relationship between these words, phrases, and clauses. And so there's some categories of conjunctions, including coordinating, correlative, and subordinating. And then there's conjunctive adverbs or transition words, which are another type of conjunction. But right now, we just want to focus on two of the main types of conjunctions, which are coordinating and correlative. And so these have similar definitions. The first is that they join grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses. And so when we're talking about words, phrases, or clauses, we can be talking about two pronouns, two prepositional phrases, or two independent clauses, etc. And so those pronouns, prepositional phrases, or independent clauses are just being joined by coordinating conjunctions. And some examples of coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, as well as nor. And then we have correlative conjunctions, which are used in pairs to join two or more words, phrases, or clauses that are grammatically equal. So you may be thinking that this is the same definition as we just looked at. Well, we still are talking about grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses, but this time we're talking about them being used in pairs. So some examples of correlative conjunctions are both paired with and, not only, paired with but also, and then either paired with or. So notice each time I have 3 dots in between the two conjunctions. And so what that is signifying is that you have a conjunction, then you have words in between, and then another conjunction. And so when we talk about joining 2 or more words, phrases, or clauses, again, we can be talking about pronouns, prepositional phrases, independent clauses. So say, for example, you have 2 independent clauses. You could say both, then you put 1 independent clauses, and then you put and write another independent clause. And so you're using these conjunctions to join these 2 phrases, clauses, or words together.
There are 2 primary uses for the semicolon in the English language. The first is to separate 2 closely related independent clauses within a sentence. If you use a semicolon, there's no need to include a coordinating conjunction such as and. The second use for a semicolon is to separate items in a list when the items are long and complicated or contain internal punctuation such as a comma. Ordinarily, you would use a comma to separate items in a list, but if the items contain commas within them, it may be confusing to separate the items with a comma. So that's where the semicolon comes in. Here we have 1 example sentence for each usage. In this first one, we have 2 independent clauses separated by a semicolon. So each of these clauses could stand on its own as a sentence, but we've chosen to combine them into a single sentence, and we do so with a semicolon. It's proper to use a semicolon in this sentence because the 2 phrases, I went to the doctor and he told me I had the flu, are very closely related to one another. Hearing that you have the flu is a direct result of going to the doctor. You would not, for instance, be able to use a semicolon in a situation where your 2 clauses were, I went to the doctor, I scored a 99 on my exam, because they're not related in the same way that these are. So in order to use a semicolon to separate 2 independent clauses, the 2 clauses must be very closely related to one another. The second example was items in a list. So as you can see here, we've got 3 items, and they are city-state combinations. So You'll recall the proper way to list out cities and states is city, comma, state. So each item has an internal comma. So it could be confusing to try to separate them with commas. So the proper usage in this instance is to use a semicolon to separate each of them. So these are the two primary uses for semicolons in English.
Adverbs can modify adjectives. So let's take a look at an example of that up here on the board. I work in an extremely tall building. So I'm going to draw a circle around the adjective here, and I'm going to draw a box around the adverb here, and I'm going to draw a line under the word that the adjective is modifying. So I work in an extremely tall building. So you could remove the adverb and adjective here, and you could just read the sentence as I work in an building, or I work in a building. So extremely and tall are the modifiers here, because a lot of times, more generally, modifiers can be removed from a sentence, and the sentence will still make perfect sense. So extremely and tall are just further describing the building. So tall is an adjective, which further describes building. Now extremely is an adverb. The temptation here is to think that extremely is modifying building. Now let's try to remove tall from this sentence and leave extremely in building, and see if the sentence makes sense. I work in an extremely building. That doesn't make any sense. That's because extremely is not modifying building. Extremely is modifying tall. I work in an extremely tall building. How tall? Extremely tall, because adverbs answer a question. In this case, the question is how. How tall is the building? So the adverb answers that question, saying that the building is extremely tall. Let's look at another example. He wrote a very concise summary. So again, I'm going to draw a box around the adverb, a circle around the adjective, and I'm going to put a line under the word that the adjective modifies. So we could remove very and concise from this sentence because they're modifiers, and we could read the sentence as he wrote a summary. Now, let's put the adjective and adverb back in the sentence. He wrote a very concise summary. Concise is describing summary. It's modifying it. It's further describing summary. Now here again, you could think that very is an adverb that's modifying summary. But if you take concise out of the sentence and read the sentence without concise in it, it doesn't make sense. See what I mean? He wrote a very summary. That doesn't make any sense. That's because very is not modifying summary. Adverbs cannot modify nouns. They modify adjectives, adverbs, or verbs. So in this case, very is modifying an adjective, which is concise. It's answering the question, how? How concise is the summary? And the adverb is answering that question by saying the summary is very concise. Choosing the correct adjective can sometimes be difficult, especially in certain confusing cases. One of those cases is whether or not to use less or fewer. That is the question. And a lot of people get this confused, so I don't want this to hold you up. Less is used when you're talking about things that aren't countable. Like you would say, there is less sand on this beach than the beach we were at last weekend, because sand's not something that's countable. You use fewer when you're referring to something that is countable. Like there are fewer doors on this house than the last house we lived in, because doors is something that's very countable. Let's take a look at some examples. There are fewer people over here. People is something that's countable, so we use fewer. This sentence says there is less water in this river. Now you could argue that water is something countable, because you could think, oh, you can count water in gallons of water. But we're not talking about gallons of water. We're just talking about water in general, and water is not something that's countable. So we use the adjective less. There is less water in this river. Now this next sentence combines cases in which we can use less and fewer. It says, use less sugar when making fewer cookies. Sugar is not something that's countable. I mean, of course you could count each individual grain of sugar, but overall, sugar is not countable. So we use the adjective less. And then we continue on to the sentence. It says, use less sugar when making fewer cookies. Cookies is something that's very countable. So we use the adjective fewer. Now finally, there is a case which makes this whole case kind of more confusing. When you're talking about something that contains a number, when you're talking about numerical things, you use the adjective less. So this sentence says, the shirt will cost less than $20. Now you may think that dollars is something that's very countable. It is, but to be grammatically correct, you use the adjective less. This shirt will cost less than $20. Or this purchase will consume less than 45% of my budget. If you're using a percentage or any kind of statistical or numerical thing in a sentence, you use the adjective less. So that's just a side note you need to remember. But overall, you use less when you're talking about something that's not countable. And you use fewer when you're talking about something that is countable.
Drafting a thesis statement. The thesis statement expresses the main idea of a composition. It should encompass every idea, detail, and argument in that one thesis statement. It should all relate in some way to the thesis. So your thesis isn't going to list out all of your arguments and details that you're going to have in your composition, but it should relate in some way to all of them. A thesis can be kind of tricky because you want it to be general enough to encompass everything that's going to be in your paper, but specific enough that the reader knows what your main idea is. It should be a short declarative statement, but it should not be vague. It needs to be specific. It can't just be a general subjective sentence that doesn't really tell the reader what's going on. The thesis statement should suggest the content of the rest of the piece so the audience knows what to expect. And if you're too vague, the audience isn't going to know what to expect. So you have to be specific without being too specific, and general without being too general. So I'll give you a few examples so you can see how to balance these things and draft an effective thesis statement. The principal is basically a nice guy. It tells you the principal's nice, but there are lots of things you could talk about that would make the principal a nice guy. This is a pretty vague statement, so let's improve upon that. Let's get more specific and give the reader more of an idea of what the content of your piece is going to be. The principal's policies demonstrate his care for students. So now, the reason we think he's a nice guy is because it's obvious that he cares for his students based on his policies. So we're not talking about the principal being a nice guy because he coaches Little League or he just says hi to you in the hallway. It's because he has policies at school that show that he cares about his students. So this is an effective thesis statement. This is a good one. This one is too vague. We had to get more specific. So let's look at another example. Dogs are good pets. Well, not everyone's going to think that, but at least if you give them more information, they may see your side of things. Saying dogs are good pets is still really vague. You need to get more specific. Why do you think they're good pets? But don't get too specific because you want your main idea to be in your thesis statement, but you don't want all the supporting details to be there. You want to save those for the body of your paper. So let's look at this this is an effective thesis statement example. Changing dogs are good pets, which is still too vague, to something more effective. Because of its sense of loyalty, its ability to be trained, and its good companionship, a dog is the perfect pet for me. Now, this thesis does actually tell you what your main subtopics are probably going to be. You'll probably have a body paragraph talking about a dog's sense of loyalty, another one about how easy they are to train, and another one about how they are good companions. This kind of thesis statement is also okay because it gets specific, but not too specific. It tells what your subtopics are going to be what your supporting overall ideas are going to be, but it doesn't get into every detail and argument that you're going to present in your composition. So this would be another good example. So one of the main things to remember when writing your thesis statement is to include the main idea of your paper, let the reader understand what they should expect from the rest of your paper, but don't be too vague or too specific. Try to focus on a short declarative statement that tells the overall idea of your paper without giving it all away. Drafting body paragraphs. Body paragraphs should follow the thesis statement of a composition. And this is both in the order they are written and that all the body paragraphs are going to support the thesis statement. You want to supply supporting ideas, details, and arguments in your body paragraphs. And many writers choose to start with the body paragraphs. And this is because they know what they want to write about, or they at least have some ideas, but maybe they don't have their thesis in mind yet. They haven't refined a thesis statement yet. So many writers will write out all of the body paragraphs first. They'll get their ideas down on paper and develop a thesis statement from that, which works out perfectly because your body paragraphs are supposed to follow and support the thesis, and the thesis statement is supposed to encompass all of your body paragraphs. Each paragraph that is a body paragraph should express a single supporting idea. You shouldn't have multiple supporting ideas in one paragraph. Pick a main supporting idea and then give more details about that one. Back up that one single supporting idea within that body paragraph. Usually, you will find the supporting idea at the beginning of the paragraph. The writer will let you know right away what their supporting idea is that they're presenting in that body paragraph. Now, sometimes the writer will save it for the end of the paragraph as a dramatic gesture, or it might be in the second sentence if the first sentence was used as a transition between body paragraphs. But usually, you'll find your single supporting idea spelled out for you in the beginning of a paragraph. However, all sentences in the body paragraph should support both the main idea of that paragraph and the thesis statement of the essay as a whole. So whenever you're writing your body paragraphs, every sentence should still be supporting that main idea, that single supporting idea of the paragraph, and it should be backing up your thesis statement. Now, your thesis statement was supposed to be broad enough to encompass everything that you're going to write about, so your body paragraphs should be able to support your thesis statement without specifically restating it. And each body paragraph should not repeat the thesis statement. You don't want to repeat your thesis statement over and over throughout your paper. What you want to do is state your thesis statement in the introductory paragraph. All your body paragraphs should be supporting that thesis with details. And then in your conclusion, you don't want to repeat the thesis statement, but you want to echo it. You want to give your readers a final reminder of what it was that you were writing about, what your main idea was. So the thesis should simply be developed, expanded, and refined in the body paragraphs. The body paragraphs are simply there to be that. They're the body of the essay. They're the meat of it. That's where you're getting all your details from. The thesis tells you what you're going to be writing about. The body paragraph is where you're actually writing it. You're giving all those details. So most of your information is going to be found in your body paragraphs. So just remember, when you're drafting body paragraphs, get your supporting ideas in there, but stick to one single supporting idea per paragraph and make sure that every supporting idea is supporting that main thesis statement.
The exclamation point is used to show strong emotion. It's important that writers only use the exclamation point sparingly, because if it's used too much, it loses its effect. So make sure it is only used when it is actually needed. So take a look at this sentence. Look at that sunrise. So basically here it depends on how the writer wants to convey this sentence. Or say this is a quotation, it depends on how the speaker said it. So if the speaker said, look at that sunrise, we would just put a period at the end. But if the speaker said, look at that sunrise, then we would put an exclamation point or an exclamation mark, as it is often called. Exclamation points can often be used after one word, like wow, look at that sunrise. So here the exclamation point is used twice because the speaker said it with lots of emotion. Now, if it's not a quotation, then it just depends on how you as the writer wants to convey a message. So if you want it to be very subtle, you just add a period to the end of the sentence. But if it's a strong point that you want to show the reader, then use an exclamation point to help that sentence stand out. But remember that many times an exclamation point is seen as being used to show that the speaker or the writer is yelling. So if you use lots of exclamation points, then the reader feels like the writer is always yelling at them. An exclamation point can often be used in place of a question mark. So, like, take a look at this sentence. What is going on? So here, generally, you would put a question mark because it's a question. But if the speaker said it like, what is going on, or the writer wants to convey that strong emotion, then you'd put an exclamation point in place of the question mark. So again, make sure that the exclamation point is used appropriately and not too often so that it does not lose its effect.
Fragments and run-on sentences. A fragment is an incomplete sentence or thought that cannot stand on its own. And it can't stand on its own and is incomplete because it's missing either a noun or a verb. So let's look at some examples of fragments. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. Now this is a lot of information. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. But you have your noun, some adjectives to describe it, an article adjective, and then you've got a prepositional phrase that tells you where they are. But you're missing something. You're missing the verb. So this one is a fragment. So you can have a longer sentence or a longer fragment that looks like a sentence and still have it be a fragment because it's missing either the noun or the verb. So we had our noun, but we were missing our verb. So even though it looks long and looks like it could be a sentence, don't be fooled by the length of a fragment because just because a phrase is long doesn't mean it's a complete sentence. Let's look at another example. Waited all day at my house for you. In this sentence, we have an action, waiting, so we've got our verb. All day at my house for you. Well, you see some pronouns in there, but there's no noun. There's no subject of this sentence, so you're missing a subject noun in this one. So it's still a fragment. You've got the verb part, you've got the predicate part of your sentence, but you don't have the subject part. So this is a fragment. It is not a complete sentence. So when you're looking for fragments, look for either a missing verb or missing noun, because if you're missing one of those, then your fragment cannot stand on its own and will not be a complete sentence. In your writing, you'll need to revise. You need to revise these, and often you can just add a little bit to a fragment to make it a complete sentence. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard look so nice this time of year. Smell wonderful. Are going to win the contest. You can finish the sentence in any way. Waited all day at my house for you. You could say, we waited all day at my house for you. I waited. My mom and I waited. It's a little bit more limited what you could put at the beginning of this sentence because we've got my and you for pronouns down here. But you still have options, and you could easily turn this fragment into a complete sentence. Now let's look at run-on sentences. A run-on sentence is a sentence that should be written as two sentences. It's too long. It contains too much information and is confusing to the reader. And if it's running on and on and on, then it's likely there's not correct punctuation and there's too many nouns and too many verbs crammed into one sentence. So you need to break it up so that you've got separate complete thoughts and it's easier for the reader to understand. Let's look at these examples of run-on sentences and then correct them. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. This is a lot of information, so we need to see where one thought ends and another one starts so that we can split it up. I couldn't believe it. Well, we want to know what she couldn't believe. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. So all that is one thought. So we're going to separate this and put a period, and we would need to capitalize the next letter, but since it was I, it was automatically capitalized. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. Now we have two complete sentences. They're separate, it's not too much information in each sentence, and it's not going to be confusing to the reader. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. So now, it's not so confusing. It doesn't just run on and on and on. We didn't have so many subjects and so many verbs in one sentence. Now we've separated it out and made it easier for the reader to understand right away. Let's look at our next example. John and Mary had so much fun they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. Now this one, we need to find where we need to split it up. We have another run-on sentence. We've got a lot of actions, but we need to see where we could split it up to keep the subject and verb of one sentence and the subject and verb of a second sentence and make it two complete sentences. We don't want to split it up incorrectly and leave a fragment somewhere. John and Mary. Let's look at what they did. John and Mary had so much fun, they. When we get to they, that's a new pronoun. That's a new subject. So we should stop there. John and Mary had so much fun. And then, if we're starting a new sentence, we need to capitalize our T in they. John and Mary had so much fun. They went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So now, we have two complete thoughts. First, we're saying they had fun, and then we're saying how they had fun. And we didn't keep it a run-on sentence to where we had this pronoun in the middle of this sentence, making it sound a little confusing. We have John and Mary having fun, and then they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So we split it up into two sentences that are easier to understand. And you also would want to revise any run-on sentences in your writing. If you see a sentence that's going on and on for 3 or 4 lines, you probably need to find somewhere in there to break it up so that it isn't a run-on sentence. You can have sentences that are more complex if you're using semicolons, etc., but you don't want it to be so long that there are too many ideas in one sentence. So when you're writing, make sure you don't have any incomplete thoughts that are missing a noun or verb. We don't want any fragments in your writing, and make sure that none of your sentences are going on so long and including too much information then it makes it a run-on sentence. Idiom. An idiom is a type of figurative language that has a meaning that's different from its literal meaning. It's used to add color to writing and make it more interesting. There are lots of idioms in the English language and even more worldwide that you could look up. Some of them may sound really funny to us, but a lot of them are based on old rituals or an old way of doing things, and they've kind of transitioned into newer days, but they have different meanings that aren't the same as the literal meaning anymore. Some examples would be kick the bucket. Well, a person isn't going to actually be kicking a bucket. It means they're going to die. If you said, oh, our old cow finally kicked the bucket, well, it just meant that the cow died. If you're bent out of shape, you're not actually bent a funny way. It means that you are upset or worried about something. If you hear something or hear from someone out of the blue, it's something that comes about unexpectedly. If you said something was a piece of cake, it would mean that it was easy. Easy to accomplish, as easy as eating a piece of cake. If you buy a lemon, it means you buy something that breaks immediately. A lot of times this refers to a vehicle, and so if you buy a used car and you think, oh, I got this great deal, and then it breaks within a few days or one of the parts breaks, then people say, oh, you really bought a lemon. But it could be anything. If you bought a sofa and you got it home and you had it for a couple days and you realized that one of the cushions was really stained or the middle of it was missing springs, and so you kind of sunk into it, then you might have bought a lemon in that way. But it basically means buying something that breaks immediately and wasn't quite what you thought it was. It turned out worse. And my last example is hit the hay. You're not actually hitting a bale of hay. It just means you're going to bed. So, idioms are figurative language. There's lots of different kinds of figurative language that you can use, but this is a fun way to add color to your writing. There are countless idioms, and most of them are commonly known. So if you use them in your writing, your reader will know what you mean, but they'll like that you tweaked it a little and made it a little more clever. You made it not just writing out the literal phrase. Especially if you're repeating a certain kind of topic or certain details several times, you may want to find different ways to say it, and sometimes an idiom can do that for you. Inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with facts and details and moves to a general conclusion. So it lists different details, different examples, and moves to a general conclusion or helps you come to a certain conclusion. Now, inductive reasoning is probabilistic, which means that it's based on probability. You hear certain facts and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to have some level of probability to it. Now, these conclusions can be strong or weak, and they can be proved false. You could come up with a conclusion that doesn't actually happen. It's not something that's true. But based on the examples you were given or the facts you were given, the conclusion makes sense, even if it's not true. And that's how inductive reasoning works. So let's look at some examples. We have seen 30 white swans, therefore all swans are white. Well, based on the 30 examples that we've seen, this statement makes sense. This conclusion that we drew using inductive reasoning based on our 30 examples would make sense. But is it true? No, not all swans are white. You've got other colors. So this isn't a true thing. This is a false conclusion. But we did use inductive reasoning to get there, basing our conclusion on our examples. Let's look at the next one. Basketball players are tall. John is a basketball player. John must be tall. Well, we don't actually know John, so we're not sure about this one. It's very probable, so this one would be a stronger conclusion than our one about the white swans, but we don't know John. John could be short. John could just be really good at making goals. That doesn't mean that he is going to be a tall person. So it's probable, it's a stronger conclusion, but we don't know for sure. We just use inductive reasoning, knowing that basketball players are generally tall, and knowing that John is a basketball player, to figure out that John is probably tall. This is called bottom-up logic. We start at the bottom with our examples, and we build on those facts, details, examples to come to a conclusion. So bottom up to the top to build our conclusion. Next, let's talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then explains the facts, details, and examples that support it. So you start with one basic conclusion, one basic statement, and then give facts and details that can support it or that are examples of that statement. This one links premises with conclusions. So you come up with a certain premise and it's linked to your conclusion that you started with. If all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So you start with this one. All dogs are mammals. Okay. All mammals have hearts. Okay. So based on the fact that all dogs are mammals and all mammals have hearts, all dogs must have hearts. So you've got dogs are mammals and mammals have hearts, which means that dogs must have hearts since they are mammals and all mammals have hearts. This is a true conclusion, and that's because all the premises are true. So if all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So on this one, we have true, all dogs are mammals. True, all mammals have hearts. So it's true that all dogs must have hearts. And this one is a true conclusion based on deductive reasoning. Now let's look at example 2. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. All ostriches can fly. So we use the fact that we know all birds can fly and an ostrich is a bird to tell us that an ostrich must be able to fly. So let's look at each of those statements. All birds can fly. Well, that one is false. There are actually about 40 different species of birds that can't fly or are called flightless birds. An ostrich is a bird. Well, that one's true. All ostriches can fly. That one is false. Ostriches are a species of flightless birds. So, since the first sentence was false, the second sentence, our conclusion ended up being false. And that may not always be the case, but whenever you don't have all your premises leading up to your conclusion true, your conclusion might not be true either. Now, we did use deductive reasoning to get there. So even though this is a false conclusion, we were basing it on the information we were given, on the conclusions that were given to us. We came up with this example of an ostrich, and it just wasn't correct. It wasn't true. So over here we had false conclusion, possibly false conclusion, true conclusion, and false conclusion. So using inductive and deductive reasoning is not going to be 100% accurate, but it is going to give you different ways to reason out information you have and try to make a conclusion based on one of these kind of logics. And deductive reasoning is also called top-down logic because you start with known conclusions and work your way to specific examples at the bottom. So you start at the top, known conclusion, work your way down to the bottom to specific examples. So whenever you are trying to figure out a problem or figure out how to connect information that you have, you can use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and just make sure that you are paying attention to whether you have facts and details to start with that you can base a conclusion on, or whether you've got broader conclusions that you're going to be coming up with examples for. And remember that they won't always be true. You might still have to go and research whether the conclusion you come up with is accurate or not. Interpretation of expository or literary text. Well, to determine what your interpretation of a work is going to be, first let's refresh ourselves on what expository and literary text are. Expository writing is going to be something that informs, explains, or describes. It's going to be very cut and dry. There's not a plot. It's basically there to explain something to you, tell you how to do something, give instructions. A science research paper would be an example. Baking instructions for baking a cake. Anything like that would be expository. So what you want to do is outline the basic elements of that paper, and then you want to evaluate their effectiveness. This is how you are going to give your interpretation. Once you outline the basic elements of the research paper or the recipe, then you can evaluate their effectiveness. Did you learn what you were supposed to learn from the research paper? Are you now able to bake a cake following those directions? Very cut and dry. Literary is a little bit different. Literary works are going to be your narratives, essays, works of fiction. These are going to have a plot. There's going to be more that you will have to go through, and because there will be so much more to the literary works, you want to focus on just one aspect to give your interpretation. You don't want to try to cover all of the elements because that would be too much and you wouldn't really get to put your personal interpretation on all of the different aspects of that work. So, some aspects you could choose from are the topic of the story, major characters in the story, major events, the setting, structure, point of view, use of language, or tone. Any of these would work. Pick one, focus on that one, and what you're going to do is explained here. An interpretation should both describe the text and elaborate upon it. So, say we were to choose major characters. You would want to describe what's in the text and elaborate upon it. And I've put that into a few steps here for you. So to describe the text, introduce the major characters. In your interpretation, describe the major characters. What do they look like? What are their attitudes? How has the author described them in the text? Then, explain how the author portrays them. Are they liked by other characters? Are they meant to be a villain or a hero? Are they just an everyday Joe? How does the author portray these characters? And then discuss what the author's purpose was. Why did the author portray them that way? What did the author want to get across to readers? And because this is an interpretation, there are going to be several different answers. There's no one right answer because no one is going to know exactly what the author's purpose was. You're giving your interpretation, what you think the author meant. So you'll describe everything that the author put in the book about the characters, and then you'll elaborate upon what the author put in there by telling what you think the author was trying to tell, what the author's theme was, what their purpose was for showing characters in a certain light. So when you are interpreting a text, With expository, you want to remember to just outline the basic elements and evaluate their effectiveness. Were you able to bake that cake? Did you learn what you were supposed to from the research paper? With literary works, you want to focus on one aspect. Out of all the different things you could focus on in a literary text, pick one, just one, and then describe that one from the text, what the author actually said, and elaborate upon it. Go through and give your opinion on it, what you think the author meant. And the thing is, it's an interpretation. Everyone's is going to be a little different. Not everyone's going to pick the same aspect to focus on, and not everyone's going to elaborate upon it the same way. So since the author knew he was writing to lots of different readers whenever he or she created this work, try to make your interpretation unique.
There are certain words and titles that need to be italicized. When typing, these words would be in italics, but when writing it out by hand, these words just need to be underlined because it is too difficult to write words in italics by hand. So here are the words and titles that need to be italicized or underlined. The titles of books, the titles of poems, long poems, the ones that could be a book by themselves, speeches, particularly famous speeches, the titles of movies, the titles of TV shows, plays, long musical pieces, and magazines. Space shuttles, planes, and ships, like the name of a space shuttle, the name of a plane, or the name of a ship, all need to be in italics or underlined if written by hand. Some words need to be in italics if you want to place particular emphasis on that word. Like if someone was saying, "come here," they could underline that word or put it in italics. If a word is expressed as a word in a sentence, then it needs to be put in italics. Like if you spell basically wrong, the writer is not using the word basically to express anything in the sentence. They are actually talking about the word basically. So that's why it's underlined. Also, there are many foreign words that are part of the English language almost because they're used so frequently. But any foreign words or phrases that are not very familiar in the English language need to be underlined or placed in italics. Like in this case, edificio needs to be underlined. So those are the important things to remember when it comes to putting words in italics.
Italics and ellipses. Italics sets apart a word or phrase from surrounding words. It distinguishes a word or phrase. It's used for book titles, foreign words, names of vehicles, used for emphasis, and for words of words. And it's used for words only, not for punctuation. So if you have a phrase or a name of something in italics and it's at the end of the sentence, the words get italicized, but the period or exclamation point or question mark at the end of the sentence does not get italicized. So let's look at some examples to see how italics can distinguish a word in a sentence and set it apart from the rest of the sentence so that you really focus on that one word. I loved Black Beauty when I was 11. Black Beauty is the title of a book and it sets it apart, and you know that's what the title is because it's in italics and the rest of the sentence isn't. So you can easily distinguish what the title is from what else I wrote. I just got a feeling of deja vu, that feeling that something's happening that's already happened before. Deja vu is a foreign word or foreign phrase, and so it is put in italics to set it apart from the rest of the sentence. The Titanic. The Titanic is the name of a vehicle. This could be cars, it could be ships, it could be planes. Any vehicle, the name of it is going to get italicized. So Titanic gets italicized. He ate not 2, but 10 slices of pizza. 10 being italicized gives emphasis to the word. You notice how when I read it, I emphasized the word 10. He ate not 2, but 10 slices of pizza. You're emphasizing just how great the number of slices of pizza was that he ate. And lastly, italics can be used to set off words of words. I love the word italics. So whenever you're saying, let's look at the word italics, or Whenever writing the words through and through, T-H-R-O-U-G-H and T-H-R-E-W, you would want to make sure you were using them correctly in the sentence. Whenever you're talking about a word and you say the word or look at this word, then you want to italicize the word you're talking about. And these would be English words because you're already italicizing foreign words. So it's English words that are words of words. That's what that means. So when you see italics, pay special attention to them and see why those words are being italicized. Is it a book title, a foreign word, the name of a vehicle, or is the author trying to emphasize something specific? Or are they just pointing out a specific word that they like or wanting you to pay attention to a certain word that they're discussing? Next, we're going to talk about ellipses, which are 3 dots, just a little dot, 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 used in formal writing to show that words are missing. And a lot of times this is used to leave out part of a long quote. But if you're doing that when you're writing, if you're leaving out part of a long quote, be sure not to change meaning. If you leave out too much of the quote or you leave out an important part, then the meaning is not preserved. So you want to make sure that you're preserving the meaning of a quote or the meaning of a passage whenever you are inserting an ellipsis. So let's look at this example. This is a quote from Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. "I cannot help it. Reason has nothing to do with it. I love her against reason." Well, that's a longer quote, and if you're trying to make it fit in your paper and your paper can only be 500 words, then you could insert an ellipsis. Ellipsis is singular, ellipses is plural. So if we insert an ellipsis, you could just say, "I cannot help it. I love her against reason." Saying reason has nothing to do with it is kind of repetitive because you're already saying, "I love her against reason. I can't help it." So putting the ellipsis here takes the place of this phrase. It lets you know, or lets the reader know, that there were more words here in this quote, but you took them out because they didn't affect the meaning. So you still get the gist of what the quote was about without having extra words in there. So you cut out 7 words with just 3 little dots. So it can be very handy when using quotes in a paper. So in your writing, pay attention to what words are italicized, see what the author is trying to tell you with those italics, and pay attention to ellipses, what was left out. Make sure that if you are using ellipses in your paper, you do not take away the meaning of the quote.
Misplaced modifiers can be very confusing, and they can distort the accurate meaning of your sentence. So let's look at this example up here on the board. The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you in class. This is a case of a misplaced modifier. Now, another word for an adverb is a modifier. So I'm going to write up here on the board adverb equals modifier. Modifier is the same thing as an adverb. So when we're saying a misplaced modifier, we're actually saying misplaced adverb. Okay, so you're looking at this sentence thinking, where is the adverb? In class, collectively, is the adverb. This is what you call an adverbial phrase. It's a group of words that collectively takes the form of an adverb, or collectively does the job of an adverb. So adverbs often answer a question. In this case, the question is, where? The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you. Where did the teacher say that? They said, in class. So in class answers the question where. So it's an adverbial phrase. Now, the reason this is misplaced, the reason this is a misplaced adverbial phrase, is because it appears to the reader that this phrase is modifying eating fruit is good for you. So it appears to the reader that the teacher is saying that to eat fruit in class is good. So it looks like the teacher is in favor of the students eating fruit while in the classroom. Now, that's not actually the case. The teacher is merely saying that eating fruit is good for you, but not while you were in class. So the better way to write this sentence would be, the teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So in this case, in class is still the adverb, still the adverbial phrase, but since it's closer to what it's modifying, it makes more sense. So whenever you are writing, make sure that you put the adverb or the adverb clause or the adverbial phrase, whatever word or group of words that's modifying something in a sentence. Make sure that the modifier is very close to what it is modifying. Make sure the modifier is close to the modified. So right here, in class is the modifier, but it's modifying the teacher said, or it's modifying the verb said. But look how far away it is from the verb said. All these words are in between it and the word it's modifying. But when you put the adverb right next to the word that it's modifying, it makes it so much simpler for the reader to understand. Now the sentence can be read correctly and understood correctly. The teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So remember, when you're writing, make sure that you don't misplace the modifier. There's something I like to call preposition overload, and that's when a writer or a speaker uses more prepositions than needed. Take a look at this first example. Where is Jim at? You notice right here that at is a preposition. However, this preposition actually is not needed. You don't believe me? Here, look, we can draw a line through at and try reading the sentence without the preposition. Where is Jim? See, the sentence still makes perfect sense without the preposition. Take a look at this next sentence. Where did Jim go to? We can again draw a line through that preposition right there too. And try reading the sentence without to. Where did Jim go? So a good way of determining whether a preposition in a sentence is needed or not is just by crossing out the preposition or reading the sentence without the preposition and seeing if the preposition still sounds grammatically correct. Take a look at this last example. It's not quite as obvious. He lives outside of the city. That sentence may sound perfectly fine, but actually try saying the sentence without the word of. He lives outside the city. The sentence still makes sense without this preposition. So again, even though this isn't very obvious, this is still a case of preposition overload. And as a writer, you don't want to use words that are not needed, because when you use more words than needed, it hinders the clarity of your writing. It's important to choose the correct pronoun when you're writing or when you're speaking. So we're going to take a look at a tip or a little trick to be able to determine which pronoun to use. So you're going to want to restate sentences twice using each subject individually. So when you want to use a pronoun, you can usually whittle it down to two pronouns that you're looking at that you're trying to decide between. So what you want to do is try the sentence twice, each time with a different pronoun, and determine which one sounds correctly. Ideally, you're going to want to be familiar with the correct grammar rules to be able to figure out which pronoun to use. But obviously, in this case, if you're trying to decide between them, you don't know the grammar rules. So you're going strictly off of sound. That's because you've heard other people use pronouns correctly. So you just plug in each of the pronouns, and you'll be able to determine which one sounds correct. So right here, we have Bob and blank will be going. So we need to figure out the correct pronoun. So it's either going to be me or I. So now we just need to try both. Like Bob and me will be going. Well, that doesn't sound very good, so let's try I. Bob and I will be going. So we know that's correct. Now here we need a pronoun as well. So it's either going to be we or us. So we can try this out. We boys played football last year, or us boys played football last year. Well, immediately we notice that boys doesn't sound correct here. In fact, we need to eliminate boys, because you never want to use a pronoun and its antecedent next to each other. Like, say, for example, we were talking about somebody named Tim. Tim would be the antecedent for the pronoun he. So say Tim went to the store. We could instead say he went to the store. So the pronoun he would be standing for Tim, which would be the antecedent. antecedent. So here, boys is the antecedent for we or us. So we don't need to use a pronoun and its antecedent, so we just eliminate boys here. So now we just try both of these. So we could say, we played football last year. Well, that sounds correct, but let's go ahead and try us as well. Us played football last year. Well, that doesn't sound right, so the correct answer is going to be we. So that doesn't take very long, and you don't actually have to write it out. Sometimes if you're just about to speak it, you can figure it out in your head. You can go through this test in your head and determine which pronoun is correct. A question mark is used at the end of any sentence that is a question. So like in this sentence, it says, where are we? This is a question, so there's a question mark at the end of the sentence. Question marks are also used in quotations that ask a question. So right here it says, is dinner at 6 p.m.? So there's a question mark at the end of the quotation because the speaker is asking a question. Notice though that there's not a question mark at the end of the sentence. There's just a period. That's because the writer of this sentence is not asking a question. Is dinner at 6 p.m., he asks, is not a question. But is dinner at 6 p.m.? Well, that is a question. So that's why the question mark only applies to the words inside the quotation marks. Also notice right here that 6 p.m. ends with a period because it's an abbreviation. Even though there's a period right here, you still use a question mark right next to the period. You probably noticed that in quotations that declare something, you just put a comma at the end. So if this was a declarative sentence, we would just leave it as a period. But since it's asking a question, we use a quotation mark. Now, this next sentence is an example of when not to use a question mark. It says, the officer asked why I was speeding. This is what we call an indirect question, because although this sentence is talking about a time that someone was asked a question, this sentence right here is not a question, so a period is just used. This sentence says, we will leave at 7 p.m., won't we? So, we will leave at 7 p.m. is a declarative sentence, so it would just end in a period. But since won't we is added to the end, it becomes a question. So that's why we need a question mark at the end. This final sentence says, will everyone please give their full attention to the speaker? So notice that this sentence ends in a period, even though this sentence technically is a question, because the speaker of this sentence is saying, please give your attention to the speaker. However, this is more of a formal request. The speaker of this sentence is not saying, is not asking for a response. They're not saying, will you please be quiet? And people are going to say, yes, we will be quiet. It's more of a formal way of saying, be quiet because the speaker is talking. So in formal requests, especially long formal requests, a period is used at the end of the sentence instead of a question mark. So the important thing to remember is that question marks are just used at the end of any sentence that is a question. Reading comprehension is extremely important. Oftentimes you'll be tested for what you read, so it's important that you understand what you are reading. I have some simple reading comprehension tips written up here on the board that I want to go over. The first is read when you are not tired. This is different times a day for different people, but for the most part this means do not read at night because you're going to be tired from the day's activity. Oftentimes people cannot read in the morning either because they are groggy from just having woken up. So make sure you read at a time when you are very alert. Read for short time intervals. Don't try to read for an hour or two at a time because you're going to get tired of reading and not retain what you read. Try to read for 30 to 45 minutes, take a break, and then read again. Read in a distraction-free environment. Get somewhere where your eyes and ears are not distracted. This means somewhere where there is not a lot of activity and where it is quiet so that you can solely focus on reading. Comprehend what you read. It's very easy to read a page and for your eyes to move down the page, but for your thoughts to be elsewhere. Stop and ask yourself as you are reading, what am I reading and why this is important? Because you wouldn't want to get to the end of a book and not have understood anything of the book and have to reread it. So make sure you're comprehending the book as you read it. Skim what you are about to read first. This means skimming the chapter, reading a title page, reading the preface and introduction, reading a chapter summary, and then reading the chapter in its entirety. Take advantage of the way a textbook is structured. Oftentimes a textbook will have major headings, italicized words, and words in bold. These are important points that you should take note of. Oftentimes chapters will have a list of important points at the end and a chapter summary. Read those as well, as those re-emphasize the important points of the chapter. So next time you read, remember these reading comprehension tips so that you can retain more of what you read. subject-verb agreement is essential to making sure that your writing makes sense. So let's look at some examples up here on the board so that you can better understand how to make your subject and your verb agree. See, the main problem that happens when subjects and verbs don't agree is that there's a certain number in the subject, but the verb doesn't agree with that number in the subject. See what I mean here? The flies are everywhere. See, flies is plural, and are is a plural verb as well. So that's why the subject and verb here are going together. So that's a great example of good subject-verb agreement. Now this sentence is talking about one fly. It says the fly is over here. So since fly is singular, the verb needs to be singular. Is a singular verb, so that's why it's used here. See, if we said the fly are over here, that wouldn't make sense. That's why we say the fly is over here. This next sentence says everything is in place. Words like everything or anyone are words that aren't very specific. So for the cases of subject-verb agreement, we consider words that aren't specific as being singular. So even though everything refers to many things, we still treat it as singular, so we use the singular verb is. This next sentence says people are here. So people is plural. That's talking about more than one person. So the verb needs to be plural as well. That's why we use the verb are. There are some sentences where you're going to have two subjects, and one subject may be plural and one subject may be singular. So the question arises, do I use a singular or plural verb? Well, the answer to that question is choose the verb or choose the word that is closest to the verb. So here we say my grandfather or my parents are going to buy a bike for me. So we would say are, because my parents is closest to are, and parents is plural, so we use the plural verb are. See, my grandfather is also a subject in this sentence. Grandfather and parents are both subjects. But grandfather is singular, so it doesn't necessarily agree with this plural verb. However, we have to choose either a singular verb or a plural verb, so it makes the most sense to base the verb off of the subject closest to it. So this sentence is the same sentence up here, just reversed. My parents or my grandfather is going to buy a bike for me. So here, we use the singular form of this verb, is, because grandfather is closest to the verb, and grandfather is singular. Parents, again, is still plural, but it's farther away from the verb than grandfather is. So the important thing is make sure your subject and verb agree in the number they are referring to, and that'll help you make your writing easier to understand on the reader's part. Subordinating conjunctions are words or group of words that make one part of the sentence dependent on the rest of the sentence. Take a look at what I mean. This sentence says the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. As long as is the subordinating conjunction in this sentence. Now, the organization will exist could be a sentence by itself. You put a period right there. And there is ample funding could also be a sentence by itself. Those two sentences could stand alone. But when we add to this first sentence, the organization will exist as long as, it makes the rest of the sentence, or it makes that sentence dependent on something else. Because if we were just to say the organization will exist as long as, that leaves us hanging. That's a fragment. It needs some other words to go along with it to make it a complete sentence. So the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. So as long as is the subordinating conjunction, making the first part of the sentence dependent on something else to complete the sentence. Let's look at one more example. Since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Since right here is the subordinating conjunction. Remember, I said a subordinating conjunction can be one word or a group of words. So up here, it was 3 words. Sometimes the subordinating conjunction is 2 words, and then often it is just 1 word, like since. So here it says, since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Now again, let's eat lunch could be a sentence by itself, and it is noon could be a sentence by itself. But when we add since to it is noon, it makes this part of the sentence dependent on some other words to complete the sentence. Because if we just said, since it is noon, that wouldn't make any sense. That would be a fragment because it's incomplete. So a subordinating conjunction makes the rest of the sentence dependent on something else to complete it. That way, since it is noon, let's eat lunch makes sense.
textual evidence for predictions. A prediction is an educated guess about what will come later in a text. Now, your predictions can be about an event or about how a character will behave. But any prediction you make must be based on information in the text or based on knowledge about literature in general. For instance, if you've seen how a character has acted in a story so far, you can make a prediction about his future actions. And with your knowledge about literature, you know the basic layout of a mystery novel, so you might be able to predict who did something in a story or how the story is going to end up based on your general knowledge of literature. And the more you read, the more your general knowledge about literature is going to increase, so you may be able to make more predictions the more you read. Now, one specific way that you might find textual support for prediction is with foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is when the author hints at something that will occur later in the plot. So sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes the author doesn't say exactly what will happen. It may mention storm clouds on the horizon, and the storm clouds could equal danger or something bad happening. So if you have a character who is going through a tough time and then they see storm clouds on the horizon, or someone mentions a storm might be coming, then that may be the author's way of hinting that something bad is coming or danger is approaching. However, sometimes foreshadowing could be more direct, as in Romeo and Juliet. They talk about how they would rather die than live without one another. And that was William Shakespeare's way of hinting that in the end, when they thought that they might live without one another, they did end up killing themselves rather than live without the other one. Sometimes foreshadowing comes in the form of a fortune teller. There are a lot of stories that include a fortune teller or someone that happens to tell someone's fortune or tell their future even without being labeled a fortune teller. And they'll say exactly what's going to happen, and then later on, that's how the plot unfolds. Now, sometimes the author will throw in what's called a red herring. And that's when they tell you what's going to happen, but it doesn't really happen. So, when a hint or prediction by the author does not actually happen. So, you have to pay attention because sometimes the author may give you a direct foreshadowing example. They may go and say exactly what's going to happen, and that'll be true. But sometimes they'll give a really big hint, or they'll even lay out the prediction with a fortune teller or by the characters just discussing how they feel like things are going to end up. But it's a red herring because that's not really how the author ends the story. So don't always think that if the author tells you something's going to happen, it's going to happen. But foreshadowing can often be a good textual support for any predictions you're going to make. So whenever you are making predictions while you're reading a story, make sure that your predictions are based on evidence either from the story itself, information in that text, or information that you've gained from reading other books and getting a general knowledge about literature. Textual support for interpretation. Whenever you're going to interpret a work, you are going to identify the author's methods, their tone, their use of language, their plot, major characters, setting. Then you're going to decide on one of those aspects of the writing, pick just one, and evaluate and analyze that one aspect. You want to give your opinion on what the author was trying to do with the use of this character or with the use of a certain tone. What was their purpose in doing that? But you want to make it stronger. And one way that you can make your evaluation, your interpretation of this work stronger, is to root your interpretation in the text. That means you go through and you find specific examples in the text that support what your interpretation is. The examples from the text support your ideas. So it doesn't look like it's just things that you're coming up with out of your head. It's things that you came up with because of something specific in the story that made you think. So one thing you can look at is quotes. Look at what characters say. This could be something that affects the tone, or it could be something that reflects on a character, or it could be something specific letting you know what's happening in the plot. Look at details from the story. It could be how someone looks, so physical characteristics. It could be specific things that happen in the plot. It could have to do with the tone as well. It could have to do with specific language that the author used. But find those details and then put them into your evaluation. Find these quotes and put them into your interpretation. So if you're trying to describe how a character acts or how you felt about a character, go back and find something specific about that character in the story and put it into your interpretation so that your essay now has roots in the text and is going to be stronger. Another thing you can do, which isn't going to pull information directly from the text you read, but is going to make your work stronger, is to find statistics or facts relating to your topic. Now, this could be, if you're writing about cell phones, you might say, a lot of people use cell phones. Well, instead of using that general phrase, you could give an actual number of people who use cell phones. Or if it's people using cell phones while driving, or while at home, or while at work, or under or over a certain age, you could look up that statistic and put it into your paper. And it's going to help because it makes things more precise. It shows you did your research. It shows you aren't just making things up from your head. You are actually going out and finding this information somewhere. The same way that you giving your opinion of a character or of the theme of a work is based on the quotes that you find or details that you find in the writing. So whenever you are giving an interpretive essay, you want to find textual support for that interpretation. Identifying the author's methods, finding one aspect to focus on, and evaluating and analyzing that is all important, but to make it even stronger, you want to root your interpretation in the text.
Transitions are very important in your writing because it helps the author understand what you are trying to convey. In short, transitions provide a smooth flow from one paragraph, idea, or sentence to another. Oftentimes, if you have two paragraphs, it is awkward to start another paragraph without acknowledging the previous one. So transitions make that exchange less awkward. Sometimes you'll have two ideas within a paragraph. It can become unclear to the reader when one idea ends and when another starts unless you have a transition. And it's sometimes within a concept or idea in a paragraph, you will have several sentences. Transitions help the flow from one sentence to the next be less awkward as well. Transitions also show how things are related. Many times your essay can appear to have many good ideas in it, but the reader is having trouble drawing connections and seeing how those ideas and concepts are interrelated. Transitions help you do that. There are many different types of transitions, and each has different uses. So if you're restating something, you can use a transition like namely, or in other words. And if you're contrasting something, you can use a transition like nevertheless, or rather. And if you're using directions, you can use a transition like to the left, or below. The important thing is to remember, if in doubt, use a transition in your writing so that the reader can understand what you are trying to convey. Sometimes choosing the correct pronoun can be difficult. Consider this sentence. Ron and blank left. So here, you either need to insert the pronoun Ron and I left or Ron and me left. So how do you choose the correct one? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you that the correct response is I. The sentence should read, Ron and I left. Now, there is a grammatical way to come to that conclusion, but there's an easy trick to figure it out. Try removing the first noun in the sentence. So if we remove Ron and then we just read the sentence like this, it's much more easy to figure out which pronoun to use. We can read the sentence two ways. We can try I left, or we can say me left. Me left obviously is not grammatically correct. So the correct pronoun here must be I left. So then that means we can plug I into the sentence, and the sentence makes sense, like Ron and I left. All right, let's look at another option, or another example. He gave Ron and blank a gift. He gave Ron and blank a gift. So here, do we insert the pronoun I or me? Well, let's try the trick again and remove Ron and from the sentence. So we can try it two ways. Once by inserting the pronoun I, and once by inserting the pronoun me. He gave me a gift. Or we could read it as, he gave I a gift. Here, I does not sound grammatically correct. So me must be the correct response, because he gave me a gift sounds grammatically correct. So me is the correct pronoun to insert in the blank. So the sentence now reads, he gave Ron and me a gift. And that is the correct way to do it. So again, the more you get familiar with these pronouns, the easier it will be to determine which pronoun to use. But you can always use the trick of eliminating one of the nouns in the sentence to figure out which pronoun you need. Notice one more thing, that I always put the pronouns second, because in this case, these sentences were referring to the speaker. So say these sentences are referring to myself. Out of respect for the other person, you should always put yourself last in the order of people. So it wouldn't be correct to say, I and Ron left, or he gave me and Ron a gift. It always is grammatically correct to put yourself after the other people in the sentence. Understanding verb tenses is critical because verb tenses are used to show when a verb took place. So if you use the wrong verb, it makes your writing very confusing. So I'm going to look at 4 verb tenses. I have them written up here on the board. First one is the past tense. Then we have the present tense, the future tense, and the past participle tense. So I want to look at 2 verbs and see what they would look like in the different tenses. So first we have the past tense. Think about the verb walk. What would be the past tense of the verb walk? It would be walked. So even if I didn't have all this other stuff about verb tenses written up here on the board, and we just had the verb walked, anyone could look at that and know that that means that that happened in the past. He walked down the street. That verb right there is indicating that he walked in the past. All right, let's look at the present tense of the verb walked. It would be the verb walks. Now, present tense means that whatever is happening is occurring now. Now, it doesn't always mean that it's happening right now. So, like, think about the verb walks. If we say he walks to school, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is walking on the road right now headed to school. It just means that every day, currently, he walks to school. Let's look at the future tense. It will be will walk. That's the future tense of the verb walk. He will walk down the street. Again, you can just look at will walk and know that means something will happen in the future. Past participle is used to show that something happened in the past before something else happened. So it's going to be similar to the past tense, but just a little bit different. We're actually going to add what's called an auxiliary verb or a helping verb, which is the verb has. So we're going to say has walked. So up here, we would just say he walked down the street. Now we're saying he has walked down the street. It's showing that that happened in the past before something else happened. Now let's look at one more verb. How about the verb do? So the past would be did, as in he did that. The present tense would be does, as in he does that. The future tense will be will do. He will do that. And the past participle would be has done, as in he has done that. So again, it's critical that you understand verb tenses and that you apply what you know about verb tenses to use the correct verb tense in all of your writing.
When taking your exam, you may come across questions where they ask you to determine fact from opinion. And sometimes this can be a little tricky. Obviously, when taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with what you know is the right answer. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're not entirely sure what the right answer is, perhaps you're running short on time, maybe 2 or 3 of the answers look like they might be correct, this little bit of advice might be very helpful, especially on this kind of question, whether it's fact or opinion. When asked about a statement, whether it's fact or opinion, remember that choices that are facts will have no ambiguous words in them. They typically will have no ambiguous words. Let me give you an example here. Listen to this sentence. How long is a long time? Well, of course, that's extremely ambiguous because long, in reference to time, may be up to each person. My young son thinks that 5 minutes is a long time, and yet 5 minutes is not nearly enough time in my experience. So the ambiguity of the word long there tips you off that this is opinion rather than fact. And it's typically this case. Let me give you one more to show you what I mean. What defines an ordinary person? Well, what's ordinary to me may not be ordinary to you or ordinary to someone else. That word ordinary, once again, is ambiguous. It's left up to each person's opinion. So that lets you know, all right, we're talking opinions here. Now, sometimes it's not clear. You may say, well, all of them seem to have some words of ambiguity in them. Well, once again, like I said, this is typically the case that fact statements typically will not have words of opinion. But if you find a situation where they all seem to have words of ambiguity, the next thing you look for is the complete context of the question. And given that context, what you usually find is that the fact answer comes out in terms of a research finding. So let me give you an example of that. The scientist found that the eye reacts quickly to change in light. So the research finding there, given the whole context of the question there, will let you know that, okay, this is the fact here. Even though there may be some ambiguity in there, I don't know the scientist, I don't know what he found, the fact that it's a research finding says, okay, this is a fact. So typically you're looking for ambiguous words, lets you know opinion, but looking at the whole context you may see, I don't see any here, just merely of facts. They all have ambiguous words. You look at the whole context and you say, okay, well, here's a research finding, that's the factual one there. So opinions are set out in the context of words like so-and-so thought something, they believed something, they understood something, they wished something. So you're looking for those opinion words, thought, believed, understood, wished. And here's an example of that. He thought the Yankees should win the World Series. That's not a statement of fact, it's a statement of opinion. And we know that because we're tipped off immediately by that word, thought. He believed, he wished that the Yankees should win the World Series. Now, hopefully this little technique will help you out when you're taking your test. I once again want to reiterate, if you know the right answer, always go with that. But when you hit a little stumbling block, when you're not entirely sure, this will help you make a better educated guess. Fact statements avoid ambiguous terminology or are often listed as research results. Opinion statements, once again, have ambiguous terminology that's up to my perception, your perception, someone else's perception, and often include the words thought, believed, wished, or understood. If you'd like to learn more about this, study further, I encourage you to go to the website linked beneath this video. If you click on the link, it'll take you there where you'll find an ebook ready for immediate download.
ACT English Sentence Structure. Linking verbs do not express action. Instead, linking verbs express a state of being. So you have action verbs and linking verbs. And so linking verbs are reserved for expressing a state of being. So an example is, John was a doctor. Was here is a linking verb, and it's expressing a state of being, John being a doctor. And then the grapefruit here is too sour. The grapefruit is too sour. So is the linking verb here, and again it's expressing a state of being because it's describing grapefruit. So in addition to was and is, some other linking verbs are am, are, were, be, being, and been. Now, a noun or an adjective is going to follow a linking verb. So when an adjective follows a linking verb, it describes the subject. So an example is, this fruit is mushy. So we already know that is a linking verb. And so we look at the word following the linking verb, and we know it has to be a noun or an adjective. And we know that mushy is an adjective, and so it must be describing the subject. And sure enough, mushy is describing the subject, which is fruit. Now, when a noun follows a linking verb, it renames the subject. So here we have he is a doctor. Again, the linking verb is, and so the word following it is doctor. And so we know that doctor is a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. And sure enough it is, because doctor and he are interchangeable here because they're referring to the same person. Now, some sense-related verbs can also act as linking verbs, such as feel, look, smell, sound, and taste. And then there's some other verbs in general that can sometimes act as linking verbs, like appear, become, grow, and seem. And so we have some verbs that can be either an action verb or a linking verb, depending on their meaning in a sentence. Some examples are appear, become, feel, grow, look, smell, sound, and taste. So right here we're using the verb grew. So here is an example of it as a linking verb. Mary grew ill. And so a linking verb is going to have a noun or an adjective following it. So here we have ill, which is an adjective. And so since it's an adjective, it must be describing the subject. And sure enough it is. It's describing Mary. It's saying that Mary is ill. Now here we have an action verb. We grew tomatoes. It's the same word, but this time it's acting as an action verb. Now pretend for a second that it is a linking verb. We look at the word tomatoes and we see that it's a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. Well, we and tomatoes aren't interchangeable because we and tomatoes are not the same thing. So we know that grew here must be an action verb. So you just have to base it off the context of the sentence when you're trying to decide whether a verb is acting as a linking verb or an action verb. But when you come up to these words up here, these verbs are always going to be linking verbs. But when you come to sense-related verbs as well as some other verbs, they can act as a linking or action verb. ACT English Strategy. I want to go over 4 methods to obtain coherence in writing. So when I talk about coherence, I'm talking mainly about consistency. And so one method is by the repetition of key phrases or words. And so when you repeat key phrases or words, you are establishing consistency in your writing because the reader can see your consistency because you're using the same phrases and words over and over. A second method is the use of personal pronouns. So this sentence says, Joe's dog walked around Joe's leg. Now, Joe's right here that's underlined is the only one that should remain. We should remove Joe's right here and replace it with his, because when we use Joe's twice, it begins to confuse the reader because they think we're talking about more than one Joe. And so by using this personal pronoun right here of his, it increases the comprehension on the reader's part, which in turn increases coherence. Because even if you have consistency in your writing, if the reader can't comprehend what you're writing, they're not going to be able to see the consistency in your writing. A third method is the use of synonyms. So this first sentence says, he went on a hike with his colleague. Now, say you don't know what the word colleague means. Well, you progress to the next sentence and read, it was his first time to hang out with a coworker. So you can easily see that colleague and coworker are indeed synonyms. And so if you did not know what colleague meant, you probably know what coworker means. And so you can just figure out what colleague means by saying that it's a synonym with coworker. And so again, this increases comprehension, which helps for consistency. Now, the fourth method is the use of parallel construction. And so parallel construction is when you have items in a series and you approach each item in the series the same way. And so this sentence says, I went to the grocery store, the car wash, and ate lunch at the food court. And so each item in this series does not have the same grammatical setup. See, you should be able to apply the first 3 words of this sentence to each part of the series. You should be able to say, I went to the grocery store, which you can, as well as I went to the car wash, and then I went to ate lunch at the food court. See, the first 2 parts of this series make sense, but the third part doesn't. You have to rephrase this sentence for it to make more sense. You can say, I went to the grocery store, the car wash, and to the food court to eat lunch. And so those are 4 methods to obtain coherence in your writing. ACT, English sentence structure. The sentence is the basic unit of communication in English. Parts of speech identify the words which make up a sentence. So some examples of parts of speech are nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, articles, interjections, prepositions, and conjunctions. So one group of words that we have is nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and pronouns. Those words perform essential functions within a sentence. In addition to performing essential functions, they also provide content. So they give the sentence its content, which makes sense because you have the nouns and pronouns, which act as subjects, and then you have your verbs, which obviously act as verbs in the sentence. In every sentence, you need a subject and a verb, which gives you the topic of the sentence, and then the verb tells more about that topic. And so you can understand how these parts of speech right here perform essential functions and provide content. And then we also have another group of words, or another group of parts of speech called the prepositions and conjunctions. And so those words connect sentences. And they connect one part to another. And when I talk about one part, I'm talking about one part of a sentence. So these prepositions and conjunctions can connect sentences to each other, and then within a sentence, they can connect one part, either one idea or one action, to another idea or action. Now, some words function only as one part of speech. However, many words can function as 2 or more parts of speech. Just depending on the context of the sentence, a word will be either one part of speech or another part of speech. And so that's a look at the different parts of speech in a sentence.
In this video, we want to go over prefixes. Prefixes are short little sections of words that come before the root of a word and help you understand what the word means. They add an extra nuance to the word. And why prefixes and suffixes, for that matter, are important, prefixes coming before the root of the word, suffixes, short little endings after the word, is that if you know your basic prefixes and suffixes, they help you determine the meaning of a word. And they're important clues, especially if you're taking a standardized test where they say we want you to find the word with the opposite meaning. Sometimes just knowing the prefix can give you enough of a clue, even if you don't know what the root means, to find the opposite. We've got a few examples on the board, and we want to go through those briefly just to show you the importance of prefixes, how they can help you in your test-taking strategies, and how they can help you understand the meanings of words. So prefixes give clues as to a word's meaning. Knowing them can help you find the word with the opposite meaning on a test. So words like prefixes like pre. Here we think pre-operative, pre-op. That means before the operation. Or prescient. Pre meaning before, and scient from the word science, which means knowledge. So to know ahead of time. So prescient is to know ahead of time. Pre-game show, the part that comes before the game. So pre means before. The opposite of pre is post. Post-operative care, the care that happens after the operation. Post-game show, the show that happens after the game. So pre is before, post is after. If you realize this opposites, then if you see a word that's got a prefix on it, then you look for a word with a post prefix on it if the test is asking you to find the opposite. Another thing would be pro and de. So pro means for, as in pro-life. Someone who is pro-life is for life. De is the negation, so deconstruction. To deconstruct is the opposite of, or the negation of construction. Construction to build up, deconstruct to destroy. So pro meaning for, de is usually a negation, pre before, post after. Knowing your prefixes can be critical, especially if you're not sure of the whole word. You can say, well, let me break this word up into its prefix, its root, and its suffix, and see if I can't decode just from that minimal information the proper answer on the other side. Now, obviously, when you're taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with the right answer. But if you're struggling, if you're not sure, this is a strategy you can use. You can look at the word, break it down, and say, here's the prefix, and I know it means this, and I'm being asked to find the opposite. What's the opposite of this prefix? Then I've got my answer more than likely. Caution though, caution. Con and pro are opposites, but congress is not the opposite of progress, although some people might disagree. That's more of a joke in terms of Congress being the opposite of progress, but con and pro are opposites, but you have to know and be careful sometimes. Anyway, that's been just a basic introduction and overview of the importance of prefixes as a test-taking strategy of knowing what they mean to help you determine the meaning of a word, and also to assist you if you're being asked to look for the opposite. If you know what the prefix means and you know what the opposite of that prefix is, it makes it a snap to find the right answer. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. While you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
ACT, English sentence structure. There are three verb tenses that I want to take a look at. And those verb tenses are present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect. So the present perfect is used to emphasize the completion of an action in the very recent past. So here's an example. I have just purchased a necklace. So this is something that was completed in the very recent past. It was just completed. Person just purchased a necklace. Now, the present perfect can also be used to indicate an action begun in the past and continued to the present moment. So here's an example of that. Sam has lived in the same house for 10 years. So this is talking about something that is happening now and may have happened for a long time, but the reason we're still calling it the present perfect is because it's coming up all the way till the present. And then we have the past perfect, which indicates how two finished actions are related in time. So the example here is before he went blind, Milton had written Paradise Lost. So we're looking at two actions here, Milton going blind and Milton writing Paradise Lost. Both of these are finished actions. And so this sentence is showing that Milton wrote Paradise Lost before he went blind. So here, the first completed action is using the past perfect, while the second action is using the simple past. And then we come to future perfect, which indicates an action to be finished before a future time. So the example for that is, I will have finished the book before I take the exam. So this is an action that has not happened yet, but is going to eventually be finished. And the sentence is telling the reader before what event that action is going to be completed. See, the writer is saying they're going to finish the book before the event of taking the exam. So that's a look at present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect verb tenses. Topics and main ideas are vital parts of a paper. So it's important that you know how to find the topic and main ideas. But first, we need to understand what those are. So a topic is a subject of a text. Basically, it's what the text is about. And the main idea is the most important point being made. So every paper includes a main idea and a topic. And every paragraph also includes a main idea and a topic. So a topic is very general. A topic is not specific at all. It just tells an overview of what the paper or the paragraph is about. So the topic of a paper could just be tennis. That's the subject of the text, or the text is about tennis. But the main idea is more specific. The main idea is like a thesis statement. It's the most important point being made in the paper. So while the topic might be tennis, the main idea would be tennis is a good form of exercise. So generally you can find the topic and main idea in the first sentence of the paper. So it might say something like, tennis is a great form of exercise. So you know there, the topic's tennis and the main idea is exercise. Or this might also be found at the beginning of a paragraph. If the paper is about something different, the paragraph may have its own topic and main idea. So the first sentence of the paragraph might be, tennis is a great form of exercise. And there, boom, you found the topic and the main idea. Some papers are more difficult and some paragraphs are more difficult, and you may have to read each sentence in that paper or paragraph and find the general theme of all those sentences, what those sentences have in common. But in general, it's very easy to find the topic. You can just scan the paper and figure out what the paper is about, and then more specifically, you can find out what the main idea of the paper is. And since the main idea is the main idea, it's the most important part of the paper, the main idea will be repeated oftentimes throughout the entire paper, generally in the introduction and in the conclusion, and sometimes in between. ACT, English sentence structure. Adjectives can be used to compare people, places, or things different in degree. So if you have a one-syllable adjective, you use the suffix er or s, or the words in front of it less or least. So say we have the word new, and then we want to make the comparative form of new, we add the suffix er to make it newer. And if we're trying to compare it with 3 or more objects, then we would put est as the suffix to make it newest. So that's the superlative form. So say you have one car and it's only a month old. You would say you have a new car. Now, if you have a car that's 1 month old and another car that's 2 months old, you would say that the 1 month old car is the newer car. Now, if you're dealing with 3 cars, one's a month old, one's 2 months old, and the other one's 3 months old, you would refer to the car that's a month old as the newest car. Now, this is in the positive sense, whichever one is newer. Now, if we're looking at this more in the negative sense, we could say the comparative form would be less new, and the superlative form would be the least new. So if you have 2 cars, again, you would refer to the one that's 2 months old, the older car, as being less new. And you would refer to the oldest car, if you have 3 or more cars, as being the least new. Now, if you have a 2-syllable adjective ending in y, you use the suffix er or est, or you use the words less or least. So say you have the word hungry, you're going to drop the y and change it to I and add er. So change the y to I and add er, so you get hungrier. It's similar with the superlative form. You change the y to I and add est, so you have hungriest. So if you have one person, you would describe them as hungry. With 2 people, you would describe one person as being hungrier, or describe the other person as being less hungry. If you have 3 or more, you would describe one person as being the hungriest, or you would describe someone as being the least hungry. Now, if you have a word with 2 or more syllables, use more or most, or less or least. So notice here we're no longer using suffixes. So if something is thrilling and you're comparing it with something else, you would say that one is more thrilling. And then if you have 3 or more, you would describe something as being the most thrilling. And then in the same way as before, you would describe one as being less thrilling or the least thrilling. So say you have one amusement park ride somewhere. You would describe it as thrilling. But if you're dealing with 2 rides, you would describe one as being more thrilling. But if you have a whole amusement park full of rides, you would describe one as being the most thrilling. Now, there are some words that we call irregular. And they're irregular in the way that we form their comparative and superlative. A great example of that is the word bad. The comparative form is worse than, which isn't even another form of bad. And then the superlative form is the worst. So that's a look at unequal comparison adjectives. ACT, English style. Word usage, or diction, refers to the use of words with meanings and forms that are appropriate for the context and structure of a sentence. So this right here is your goal as a writer, to use words with meanings and forms appropriate for the context and appropriate for the structure of a sentence. Now, a common error in word usage occurs when a word's meaning does not fit the context of the sentence. This sentence right here says, Susie likes chips better than candy. Now, the appropriate word here is than, not then. Then is an inappropriate word for the context of the sentence. So it makes more sense to say Susie likes chips better than candy, because than is used in comparisons while then is used in more of a chronological sense, like I went to the store, then I ate lunch. Another example would be the cat licked its coat. The correct form is the cat licked its coat. Now, its and its are homonyms, which are words that sound the same but have different meanings. And you may be thinking, anytime a word is possessive, shouldn't it have an apostrophe? Which generally that is the case, and here its should be possessive. But with the case of the word its, you only use an apostrophe when you're talking about the contraction. So right here, the sentence is saying the cat licked it is cold. So that doesn't make sense, so obviously you're not supposed to use the apostrophe. Now, I just mentioned homonyms, and errors in word usage frequently occur with homonyms, which again are words that sound alike but have different meanings. So some examples of homonyms are it's and its, affect and effect, and there, and there. So it's very easy for a writer to confuse these words because they sound the same. Now, some other words that are commonly confused are then and than, and except. Now, these words aren't homonyms, but they're very close to being homonyms because they don't sound exactly alike, but they are pretty close, which makes determining which word to use a little bit more difficult.